I came across a video recently claiming that African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans are not of African descent, but instead Native Americans, and that the slave trade was told in reverse. The claim was that we were not trafficked from Africa to the Americas, but instead that we were already in America and trafficked to Africa, and then shipped from Africa back to America. Yeah, it didn't make sense to me either. Within this video, they discuss Liberia as an example of this slave trade from America to Africa and claim this is proof, but that wasn't correct. So let's start from the beginning. In 1791, a revolution known as the Haitian Slave Revolt. Notice that instead of this being labeled as a revolution to overthrow the colonizers and slave masters, it was instead called a revolt. It was the most successful slave rebellion in history. This revolution secured black independence in Haiti and was the start of the end of the slave trade. I've heard many people claim that Europeans, such as Abraham Lincoln, were the reason that slavery was abolished. This is not the case at all. The Haitian Revolution triggered a wave of many revolutions across the Americas. The US, Spanish, and French governments had no choice but to end slavery. It was either that or death to the slave masters across the Americas. How does Liberia come into play with this? Well, in the early 1800s, the American government had a dilemma on their hands. That dilemma was the fear that the slaves involved in the revolts would turn on the slave masters and kill them all. So the US government devised a plan to protect themselves whilst in their thoughts ridding themselves of problematic African slaves. The US government decided that they would send enslaved Africans involved in the revolts back to Africa. However, this did not stop there. The United States government purchased some land which was originally part of Ghana and the Ivory Coast. This land would later be named as Liberia. Liberia was founded by the American Colonization Society in 1822 as a place to settle freed slaves who no longer wished to remain in the United States. Although the American Colonization Society was set up as an anti-slavery organization, it was actually a ploy to get rid of freed slaves as they were deemed the most dangerous and untrustworthy. This relocation of freed slaves started as a choice and an option for the freed slaves, but later became compulsory in many southern states. This was due to many areas in the South at that time not allowing the freed slaves to essentially live as free men. The state of Tennessee stipulated a law that freed slaves had to be sent to Liberia out of fear of retaliation. A government-funded emancipation concept was created, with a law that transferred $10 to every freed men and women relocated to Liberia. This was funded by not only the government, but so-called charities as well as private donors and benefactors. The voyage to Liberia took an average of 40 days. It was from America to England, and then from England to Liberia, with all the settlements for the freed slaves being on the coast of Liberia. But there was an even darker reason for this relocation of freed African American slaves, a financial reason as well as a ploy to continue slavery. Montgomery Bell was the most prominent ironmaster of his time. He owned over 300 slaves that he sent to Liberia in the 1850s, funded by himself, and also bought them land, with the sole purpose that these now freed slaves would work for him in Liberia. Within 6 months, the freed men and women started sending back bars of iron to Montgomery Bell, which made Liberia an extremely profitable place for the freed slaves to be. Well, extremely profitable for Montgomery Bell. Bell sent over 3 waves of freed men, which he called Iron Men, to work and live in Liberia. But the story of Liberia doesn't end here. When the freed men and women arrived in Liberia, they created their own government on the land, based on the American Constitution and laws. They built houses and plantations identical to that of the ones they worked back in America. It was the freed men that named the land Liberia, and also named the capital Monrovia, after the then President of the United States, James Monroe. Liberia attracted many different nationalities of African people, as it was the first republic country of its type governed by black people. The freed American men and women were now in charge. They ruled over Liberia. They finally had freedom. However, these oppressed people very quickly became the oppressors. They themselves enslaved the African people and forced them to work. The African Americans took on the role of their slave masters and enslaved their brothers and sisters for the benefit of the Europeans. Slavery had ended and been abolished. It was now illegal for Europeans and European Americans to enslave African people. But a loophole allowed black people to enslave their own people on the continent of Africa. But who would benefit from this? The slave masters in the West were still able to benefit from slavery without technically breaking any laws. They would pay the freed African Americans for the labor and work forced upon the indigenous Africans of that land. whilst the African people indigenous to the land were enslaved and paid nothing. The African Americans became the slave masters. This shows you that the Europeans and European Americans don't do anything unless it's to their benefit. This is a very brief breakdown of the history of Liberia, to give you an idea of what happened and the important role Liberia can play in our own liberation today, and why we must be mindful to not fall into the trap of becoming like our oppressors. But I've also added a documentary directed by Nancy Oku Bright, which will give you an in-depth breakdown of everything that happened and the effects. This is definitely worth watching, so hopefully you watch it all the way through. But if not, hopefully my brief version will suffice.
Liberia was Africa's oldest republic, founded 133 years before on the promise of peace and freedom for the American blacks who settled here during the time of slavery. Liberia's story began in 1820 when 86 black passengers set sail on the Elizabeth from the United States for the west coast of Africa. It was 200 years after the first Africans were bound and shackled, transported against their wills to the New World. Now their descendants were heading back to Africa, back to the land of their ancestors. They carried everything they owned. There was no turning back. The passengers had waved goodbye to their families and friends, many of whom they knew they would never see again. The genesis of the voyage was a slave revolt on the island of Santo Domingo, today's Haiti, and the violence it unleashed only miles away from America's shores. It was there, in 1791, that Toussaint Louverture led an uprising of black slaves. Hundreds of slave owners were killed and their plantations set ablaze. After years of oppression and exploitation, the slaves turned on the white plantation owners.
Africans basically said, enough is enough. We must be free. The only way to make it happen is by armed rebellion against our oppressors, against our enslavers. They're not successful in Brazil, but they are successful in Haiti. The word of that spreads like wildfire amongst the enslaved Africans. They don't have a newspaper, but they hear freedom is on the way.
Waves of white refugees from Haiti poured into U.S. ports, and the tales they told filled Southern whites with absolute terror. On December 21, 1816, a remarkable gathering of men met in Washington, D.C. There were Quakers who detested slavery and slaveholders who detested free blacks. Together they formed the American Colonization Society. Its purpose, to send free blacks to Africa to reduce the possibility of slave revolt in the U.S., and also to extend what they call the civilizing influence of Christianity to the black continent. Members of the organization included Bushrod Washington, nephew of George Washington, Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, and James Monroe, future President of the United States. Most free blacks were deeply suspicious of the group's motives, yet some joined the enterprise despite their misgivings. Others felt that once in Africa they could finally determine their own future.
Because here, folks made the conscious choice of leaving the United States and returning to Africa, under the notion, many saying, I could never be free in the United States. How could these people who enslaved me for these many years accept my humanity? they will always question whether I am a human. Right? This was a common sentiment amongst many of those who returned to Africa.
5 weeks out of New York Harbor, after a calm voyage, the Elizabeth came within sight of Africa's west coast, at Sierra Leone. Here, on a small island, they waited for land. They couldn't depict a worse time or place. It was the rainy season, in a disease-ridden marshland with little fresh water. A death trap.
You read the letters they wrote back. This turns out to be a 2-year wait. And everybody's getting sick. They're getting malaria. Because they're not immune to malaria. The mosquito bit them, they got sick, and they died. And they died in large numbers. It was a total catastrophe.
With land assigned to them, the survivors sailed down the coast to settle what would become Liberia. Over the next 40 years, thousands of blacks from America, the West Indies, and other parts of Africa joined them. They took with them the American experience of slavery. They would come to dominate, exploit, and neglect the indigenous people they met on the coast. But they also married them and assimilated with them. Most of the early black settlers built their homes here, along the St. Paul River. They brought with them some of the place names they'd left behind. New Georgia, White Plains, Maryland in Africa, Mississippi in Africa, Virginia. They transplanted the architecture of southern plantations where most American blacks still lived as slaves. My great-grandfather, who came from North Carolina, lived in a house very much like this one. Many of the first black settlers were literate, and quite a few had owned businesses in the United States. Yet for almost a quarter of a century, white governors of the Colonization Society oversaw the new settlements. They even sent back reports on how the settlers dressed, kept their homes, and set their tables. The settlers had to share the land with indigenous tribes whose customs were far from theirs. This is Dimeh, a traditional village in the interior, home to the Gola, my mother's people. The Gola, along with the Kisi, are some of the oldest inhabitants of the region. More than a dozen other tribes migrated later. The Pele, Vai, Mende, Day, Kru, Gio, Mano, Kra, Bele, Loma, Grebo, Bassa, Mandingo, and Bandi, each distinct from the others. The settlers would enter the ethnic mix. Long before the settlers arrived, though, the Zos, our ceremonial spirits, celebrated death, welcomed the harvest, and initiated the young into adulthood. Today I dance with them, but as a child I feared them and the great powers I believed they had. The land was bountiful. The tribes traded with Europe since the 16th century, offering traditional hand-loomed cloth. Prized red pepper, called grains of paradise, led Europeans to name this the Grain Coast, and there were cowrie shells and soap for sale too. But no trade was as profitable as the slave trade. All the coastal tribes were involved, some more powerful than others, like the Bassa.
They were warring people. They had very strong ancient army. And so they could sweep up anybody they met on the road. That's how they occupied the entire seacoast. They had two major trades, salt and slavery.
The countryside may look idyllic, but it has known terrible violence. Here, indigenous tribes raided each other for slaves. A few tribes allied themselves with the newcomers, allowing them to dominate the coast with help from the U.S. Navy. In the area they controlled, the Colonization Society and the settlers were determined to create a sort of black America overseas.
Many began to look at Africa and to look at it with missionary eyes. I can go and help civilize Africa. They're not going to take up speaking the African languages, although they might ultimately. But that is not their mission. Their mission is to teach English. Their mission is to form schools. Their mission is to convert the heathens so that they can be nice and civilized and practice Christianity. That implies a certain attitude towards the place and the people that you're colonizing, and they came with that attitude, and as a result they rendered the indigenous inhabitants of that area as second-class entities.
They came to educate the people, build new cities, as you can see today. But the fact was, the people wanted them to accept their culture, which they didn't agree to. This is what brought the conflict. Wherever the settlers settled, they marry indigenous women, but the offsprings become completely settler with settler mentality, settler culture, settler values. Because once you look back again into one of the reasons why this country was founded. This country was founded to serve as a beachhead for the dissemination of civilization and Christianity in Africa.
All hail Liberia, hail, all hail.
In 1847, 26 years after the settlers arrived from America, they declared themselves an independent republic to be called Liberia. Its great seal, fashioned after the seals of American states, gave picture to the motto, "The love of liberty brought us here." The flag was based on the American flag, the government on the U.S. government, the Constitution on the U.S. Constitution, and like the American Constitution, no mention was made of the indigenous people. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, a freeborn black from Virginia, was elected the first president. He would be received in the courts of Napoleon III and Queen Victoria, who gave him a gunship to combat slavery along the coast. He and his senators, all American-born, resolved to create a country based on the principles of justice and equal rights. The capital city was named Monrovia in honor of America's President James Monroe, who had secured $100,000 through Congress for colonization. Far-flung business ventures flourished, and a university was built. In this nascent democracy, presidents would be elected and in one case impeached. Yet the early leaders also established an oligarchy that exploited the locals. 80 years after its establishment, in an Africa now divided among Europeans, Liberia, the only black republic, came under intense scrutiny. The story involved young men from the Kru tribe.
In the 1820s, the British landed on Fernando Po to establish an anti-slavery base. and they brought crew laborers from Liberia, what became Liberia. Brought them down, built a settlement, and then left. But crew laborers continued to come. Now, as Liberia grew in the 19th century, it tried to control crew migration. It tried to tax it, charge head monies, etc. So that eventually the state in the 1920s is charging foreign users of crew labor. And then when labor no longer wanted to go, it began coercing labor.
The Liberians, it is true, were negotiating labor agreements with the Spanish, who controlled the island of Fernando Po, and were sending Liberians to work the plantations there. And the terms, it was a virtual kind of slavery.
A person would sign up for a 2-year contract, put their X in a book, be recruited by a headman, march to the coast, and then put on a ship bound for Santa Isabel on the island, where the island was producing cocoa. And often these people were not paid. Sometimes they were underpaid. Sometimes they never returned. And so that you had forced labor, which was not slavery per se, but of course if the worker never returned, it seemed very much like slavery. And also the workers had very little choice in saying no. The people who benefited from this traffic were a minority of Liberians, a group around President C.D.B. King, King's brothers, future President Tubman in Maryland County, a number of women who provided food and comfort, and certain indigenous headmen who provided labor.
The League of Nations so found a strong report criticizing the Liberian government, a report drafted by Charles Spurgeon Johnson, an outstanding African-American sociologist.
The League demanded the practice cease, and the Liberian legislature compelled the president to resign. Liberia almost lost its sovereignty as Britain and France called for the country to be mandated.
In the 1920s, forced labor was de rigueur in parts of colonial Africa. Still in the Belgian Congo, still in the French colonies, still in the Portuguese colonies. And so here you have little Liberia being picked out as example of forced labor. Well, the major investor in Liberia was Firestone Rubber of Akron, Ohio. And there was some evidence that Firestone Rubber was using coerced labor.
In the 1920s, as the U.S. automobile industry was expanding, Harvey Firestone, the tire magnate, was looking for a way to break the British monopoly on rubber. He found an opportunity in Liberia. Rubber was Liberia's white gold. W.B. Du Bois, an African-American intellectual, had taken a special interest in Liberia's welfare. He had visited there in 1923 as the U.S. Special Envoy and regarded West Africa as his motherland. So, when he heard that Firestone was interested in Liberian rubber, he took the initiative.
He wrote a letter to Harvey Firestone encouraging him to pursue this interest, but at the same time rather typically lecturing Mr. Firestone that this was a trust, it couldn't be business as usual, exploitation should not be in the cards.
Firestone negotiated a 99-year lease for up to 1 million acres at 6 cents an acre. Any gold, diamonds, or other minerals found on the land would belong to the company. The company promised to develop Liberian infrastructure.
Liberia has a wonderful natural harbor, which only needed developing, and the Firestone Corporation said that it would do that. There were all sorts of infrastructural commitments that were supposed to eventuate from the agreement.
Firestone did not build the promised port, but it did, however, provide the Liberian government with a loan.
The terms of that loan were clearly designed to hostage the Liberian government for many, many years. That debt, to liquidate that debt, would virtually place the Liberian government at the mercy of the Firestone Corporation.
And so, Firestone established the world's largest rubber plantation. The company earned huge profits and made some of the Liberian elite rich.
Papaya kune, papaya kune, papaya kune, papaya kune.
The new republic wasn't perfect, but it was the only one in Africa. It was a beacon for Africans, West Indians, and African Americans enchanted by a country governed by blacks.
Papaya kune, summer.
By this time, Liberia had entered a new age with its 18th president. He was William Vakanarat Shadrach Tubman. A former jurist and teacher, he had led Liberia since 1944. Tubman oversaw an unprecedented building boom. He turned Monrovia into a modern city. Africans called it Little America. He granted women the right to vote. He instituted an open door policy to increase foreign investment, and a unification policy to integrate what had become two different Liberias, one westernized and the other not.
When we took office, there were those that came from the United States, considered themselves a separate class. Now nobody's afraid of each other. People from the Gribbos, the Crews, the Bassos, the Pellis, the Madingos, the Llamas, and all of the people go freely and interchange.
That, I think, was a major psychological lift to enabling all Liberians in the political sense to see themselves as equal, operating in political jurisdictions that were of equal legal standing, equal political standing. I think that was something that created a basis to build upon.
The Royal Yacht Britannia arrives at Monrovia in the African Republic of Liberia with Queen Elizabeth, who is winding up her tour of African nations. Accompanied by the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, she is greeted by President and Mrs. Tubman.
Tubman was a consummate diplomat. He brought kings and queens to Liberia and traveled like an emperor abroad. It was hugely extravagant, but it placed Tubman and Liberia on the world stage. The country's upper class reveled in Western ways. The rest of Africa, no matter how poor, seemed to love it too. Not only could Africans be great politicians, but they could also do it with style and flair. But all this pomp and circumstance emphasized the gap between rich Monrovia and the poor hinterland. Tubman had a luxurious retreat with a farm and private zoo. His tastes combined the best of the West with the country diet of his youth.
He likes Westgate, black liver. His diet, his food he like is palm butter and rice, sugar. Sometimes he will smoke 4 or 5 cigars a day.
With his cigar and top hat, Tubman became a power broker in Africa. He was one of the founders of the Organization of African Unity. And at the same time, he was tightening the bonds with the U.S. Americans trained the Liberian army, and in the Kennedy years, the Peace Corps was everywhere. In a divided world, Tubman would come to master Cold War politics. He invited the U.S. to make Liberia a key staging post for America's fight against communism in Africa, and prospered accordingly.
They were always willing to give us facilities in Liberia. For example, we had unlimited use of Roberts Field, Roberts Port. We had 2 vast antenna stations there, one for diplomatic communications, one for Voice of America broadcasting, and we had an Omega navigation station there run by the Coast Guard. So it was a perfect relationship for us.
Tubman also used the Cold War as an excuse to increase his own power. He would gag the press and use ideology to quell opposition.
Don't you know that communism is infiltrating everywhere? And you will see that you will wait and see the house burning before you provide means to extinguish it. Prevention is better than cure. That's what we're trying to do, prevent.
President Tubman of Liberia, a great leader of African First Republic.
We all grew up on this diet of, shall I say, Tubmanism, whatever that is, but the grand old man who ran the country and who organized a system that was rather personal in nature. And those of us who had gone to school, to university during that period had wished perhaps for a slightly more open society.
But openness and democracy were not thriving in Liberia. Tubman celebrated the occasion when he changed the law to allow himself unlimited terms in office. His rule went from personal and paternal to authoritarian because, he said, people liked it that way.
Why doesn't the two-party system work in Liberia?
The two-party system does work in Liberia when the people are not satisfied. But when they're satisfied, they simply don't bother. The last 2 elections, I had no opposition. The first 3 elections, I had opposition. But there's nothing to prohibit it. The law is there. And I like an opposition. I tell them all the time. I like opposition. We want an opposition party. We'll encourage it. But we're not going to hand over the thing to you. You've got to fight for it.
Tubman's close friend and ally, David Coleman, did challenge Tubman. What happened next is hotly disputed. Tubman's supporters accused the popular Coleman of plotting to have Tubman killed with this gun. But Coleman's daughter believed that her father had been set up.
It was their plot, Tubman's plot, in order to arrest all the independent party people or kill them as they planned.
Coleman was pursued at the family farm.
My mother saw all the soldiers jumping out and just surrounding. They just started getting out of the cars and surrounding the house with guns pointed towards the house. And my mother, she went and lied down on the grass outside. And she said, "God, are you dumb?"
David Coleman and his son John were shot dead. Few dared attend their funeral. With Coleman's death, all formal opposition ended. When Tubman died in 1971, the nation both wept and exhaled. His great but flawed presidency had come to an end. Tubman's 27-year reign had gone from open to closed, from democratic to dictatorial. Called the father of African democracy, he was an autocrat at home. He had strangled all political freedom and expression, and this left a boiling pot of national frustration for his successor to inherit. The next president, William R. Talbot, came from the same ruling clique. He was vice president for 19 years under Tubman, but now he was determined to change Liberia. No top hat for him. With casual safari suit, Talbot welcomed Pat Nixon to Liberia. She came to represent the United States at his inauguration on January 3, 1972. Talbot proclaimed he wanted a government that was genuinely African. He wanted Liberia to be a force for African unity and civil rights.
We must ally ourselves against the common enemies of poverty and disease. And we march with the eternal cadenza of peace, of human upliftment, and of dignity at home and abroad.
He promoted Liberian culture, therefore he promoted African culture. See, so under him there was a movement to get away from this illusion that Liberians were Americans planted here in Africa.
In his quest for a more open society, Talbot loosened the reins of government control over people's lives, allowing a free press, debate, and dissent. Talbot began to tear down slums, replacing them with the first low-cost housing estates. He built roads and negotiated better deals with foreign companies, including Firestone. The American ambassador thought he was heavy-handed. He further alienated his American allies by welcoming the first Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban ambassadors to Liberia, realigning Liberia's position in the Cold War equation. At the United Nations, he spoke against U.S. positions.
We must equally insist on full recognition and respect for the national rights of the Palestinian people by the State of Israel, especially their right to self-determination and a state of their own. Israel must withdraw from all occupied Arab territories.
But his problems were at home. The economy stagnated, and the old guard of his party was resisting his political reforms. A fresh generation of student activists appeared on the scene and took full advantage of their newfound freedom to speak out.
Our philosophy will be what it's always been, to work towards the achievement of an equal and just society in Liberia, to work for a society based upon freedom, justice, and total equality.
I saw this as a society that had remained impervious to change. You had a society led by a political party which had been entrenched in power for more than 100 years. This country was like a tea kettle that was boiling. And if they're all practical people and they want to keep the society going, they will have to open it up, they will have to lift up the lid and allow the steam out.
Increasingly, Talbot became a tragic figure. His efforts to modernize the economy came up against the oil crisis of the 1970s. His bringing more indigenous people into government was resisted by party hardliners and ignored by his opponents. The general perception continued to be that the ruling elite consisted only of people of American settler ancestry. Talbot was being accused of personal corruption and nepotism. When he received the keys to a new private jet, he joked that he needed it because he wanted progress fast. A daughter was Deputy Minister of Education, a son was Ambassador at Large, and a younger brother was Minister of Finance. Altogether, 23 of his relatives were in senior government positions. The economy was in disarray, unemployment was rising. When Talbot proposed raising the price of imported rice, Liberia's staple food, expecting that local production would consequently increase, this was the last straw. Political dissidents took advantage of his proposal.
The president was one of the largest growers of rice in the country, and a price increase would have made him obviously a beneficiary. His brother was the largest importer of rice in the country. There were people who were close to the president who also had licenses. And at the time, you had to have a license to import rice, and licenses were given to specific people. Well, we posed a challenge to this increase. The salaries as they were, and we said that if the government would not rescind this decision, we would put people on the streets.
On April 14th, 1979, thousands of Liberians took to the streets. The demonstration turned into a riot. The police shot into the crowds, killing civilians. The organizers were arrested.
It was a radical turning point. For nearly 24 hours, this government was paralyzed, the Talbot government. He never expected this. We never expected it. It took everyone by shock that people could get on the street, destroy things. He was not really a politician. He was a minister and a good businessman. And he didn't have that control over the country as Totman had.
The lower ranks of the army sympathized with the demonstrators. They quickly realized that Talbot's hold on the government was tenuous.
Many soldiers who were in the military at the time have talked about the president's appearance to them. You know, he addressed them on the morning of the rally when they came from Todi and all of that. The president came down in the morning in his morning robe and his pajamas to talk to these soldiers before they were deployed, and his was an approach of an appeal. And it dawned on many young fellas that, you know, this question of the military being the bedrock of the authority of the state, and that they had some powers. The rank and file of the military began to feel his own power.
Not confident in his own soldiers, Talbot requested support from the President of Guinea, who sent in troops to calm the situation, infuriating the Liberian army. Now under intense pressure, Talbot was forced to release the organizers of the demonstration.
The organizers of that demonstration were granted amnesty and are now free, enjoying all the political and human rights of Liberian citizens, including the right to form and manage their own political organization and to use their headquarters for that purpose, with the express provision by government that they operate within the limits of the laws of Liberia.
But his authority was undermined. He appeared ineffectual and weak.
Some months ago,
by now, he had lost support in the army, he had lost the support of his party, and he had lost support in the streets. In the capital, there was talk of rebellion.
One could sense that unless we could break some impasse, you know, there were violent disruptions on the horizon.
In the early morning of April 12, 1980, a group of enlisted men entered the executive mansion and fought their way into the presidential quarters. President Talbot was shot and disemboweled. The man who led the assault was Samuel Kayando, a 28-year-old master sergeant with an 8th grade education. leader of Liberia's first military coup.
We know that what you have done has never happened before in the history of Liberia, but it was most necessary because of the following reasons. There has been uncontrollable corruption.
The military, which earned $80 a month under Talbot, were promised an immediate reward.
Already, we are directed that all enlisted men and men of the Armed Forces of Liberia and law enforcement agencies to be paid at least $250 a month.
At first, much of the country seemed jubilant. A man of the soil, it was said, would finally rule Liberia. Some even went so far as to compare Doe to an earlier savior.
Jesus Christ was born unto a poor man and in the stable among animals. David the Israelite, destroyer of Goliath, a poor shepherd boy. Head of state Samuel Kanyado, a master sergeant. Member of the People's Redemption Council. Member of the People's Redemption Council, sergeants and enlisted men. The analogy is drawn in history.
People came from all parts of the country to celebrate. Like the majority of the people, Doe was from one of the indigenous tribes. His supporters thought of the coup as getting rid of Americo-Liberian domination.
The so-called Americo-Liberians have come into a society that they didn't understand, and quite frankly refused to understand over the years, either out of fear or out of ignorance or just out of the sheer incapacity or inability to comprehend the dynamics of this society.
The coup leader's People's Redemption Council prepared a list of enemies of the state. It included members of the Talbot family and current and former government officials.
This is Mika Television coming to you from the Poststaki, where
Talbot's cabinet was stripped, paraded in public, and humiliated. All were damned as Americo-Liberian.
Monday, April 14th.
The cabinet Talbot had, 80%. And even those so-called Americo-Liberian, all the parents were not Americo-Liberians. You see? So, but it was something that had been ingrained into them, etc. And so they came up with that. And that it is our time now.
The army moved swiftly to arrest and prosecute so-called enemies of the people. At the Ministry of Justice, a series of trials took place. Indigenous cabinet ministers such as Jackson Doe tried desperately to disassociate themselves from the fallen regime.
Officials of my background, I would like to put it that way, sat down and watched many things happen. This is why I started off by congratulating the head of state and members of the People's Redemption Council for this change.
Please tell us how many houses, lots, and or farms do you own?
Jackson Doe's life was spared, but others were not so fortunate. The trials were organized by the new Justice Minister, Che Chipo. His predecessor was his foster father, who was about to be executed. The foster father was Americo-Liberian, while Chipo was indigenous. So here, in effect, is Chipo washing his hands of his father's death.
The tribunal deemed it necessary in their judgment to have found the gravity of the crime to be equal to a death penalty. So they imposed that penalty. Then I don't know in what manner I have anything to do with it.
Will you allow us to have a copy of the judgment?
On the day of the executions of the 13 people, I was in my classroom in the university, and some reporter came and told me, say, you know, they're going to have some executions, but they've delayed them because there are not enough polls. And that was an ominous sign of what was to come. I sort of packed my bags and went home, took a bath, and went to bed, feeling sick, very, very sick.
My father, whose family had immigrated to Liberia from Nigeria and Sierra Leone, had once been a leader of Talbot's party. When the new Doe government demanded that former officials turn themselves in, he complied and found himself sharing a cell with some of the men who had been sentenced to death.
The sun was up, everything was bright and clear, but all of a sudden, everything became dark. A storm. But we were in the cell, we did not know why. We could not account for it. But everything went bad. It really stormed. The day was dull, very, very dull. So dismal day.
In this atmosphere of random justice, my father was released. But 13 others were awaiting execution. Of those, only 4 had actually been sentenced to death, and 2 had been recommended for pardon. The bodies were dumped in a mass grave. In the days following the revolution, people chanted, "Indigenous women give birth to heroes. Americo-Liberian women give birth to thieves." At his first press conference, sitting with his mother, Doe looked less like a victorious leader than a man who had triggered events he hardly controlled. He didn't know who many of the executed ministers were, nor did he understand the complexities of the task ahead.
So can you tell us what plans you have for the country immediately?
I can't tell you now. Can't tell you.
We know that.
Yeah, so you know that. What are the main problems facing the country, do you think?
No problem.
If you were to identify one particular area of the country's economy or its justice, which would you say you will become more interested in?
Well, the Minister of Economy can elaborate on that one.
Yes.
Sir, would you be changing your policy or reviewing your policy with the United States government?
We'll still continue on the old policy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Praise for the coup came from Libya, Ethiopia, Cuba, and other Eastern Bloc countries. U.S. condemnation of the killings was swift. Yet 6 weeks after the coup, a previously scheduled American delegation arrived to offer support.
To have the opportunity to come and visit with you and the other officials of your government to discuss the needs of your peoples and to also discuss future relations between our two nations.
Samuel Doe represented a rebellion of the country people, the original inhabitants. The population of Liberia, the majority being country people, sort of liked that. It showed that the Americo-Liberians were no longer dominant, and there was a popular change. So the United States had no reason to change that, or try to go against that. And we accepted Samuel Doe like the people of Liberia did.
They had no idea of the workings of the international political system. they had no concrete, more rational understanding of the social dynamics on the ground. So within a year or two, that government, the People's Redemption Council, became more corrupt than all the governments that preceded it.
But for the Americans, particularly Ronald Reagan, the new Cold War warrior in the White House, Doe was a useful ally.
It's been a pleasure to welcome Liberian Head of State Samuel K. Doe on his first visit to the United States. It's especially fitting that we should be meeting this year as the United States and Liberia celebrate 120 years of diplomatic relations. Our discussions gave us an opportunity to reaffirm the special friendship and mutual respect between our two countries. Clearly, a firm bond unites Liberians and Americans who have come together professionally and socially throughout the years.
The U.S. strategy for Liberia was spelled out in the then classified White House document. Liberia was important to protect valuable U.S. facilities and military access rights, to protect U.S. private investment, to prevent the spread of Libyan, Soviet, and other hostile influences. And, because of the unusual historic relationship, to avoid a major defeat or embarrassment for the United States through Liberia's political or economic disintegration. This was Doe's proudest moment. He did everything Washington wanted, including criticizing other African states for not being sufficiently anti-communist. He also challenged some African leaders to fistfights for insulting Ronald Reagan.
Doe also at the time was said to have learned how to speak English better by watching the great communicator communicate on videotape. And he had a satellite dish set up so that he could watch all of Reagan's speeches.
In the first 4 years of Doe's regime, he received almost $500 million from the United States, more than any previous Liberian administration. In spite of American aid, life in Liberia grew worse. Streets were filthy, development stopped, poverty increased, healthcare and education collapsed. Doe considered the national treasury his own.
Doe and his people had about a third of the $220 million economy. They had those people. They could basically take a third of it for whatever purpose they wanted, for buying cars, for buying clothes, whatever.
Doe's corruption was becoming an embarrassment to the U.S. The White House pressured Doe to return Liberia to civilian rule. Finally, in 1985, elections were held, with the largest turnout in Liberian history. Doe manipulated the election and declared himself the winner.
It was very clear that it was stolen. I mean, I went to a barracks where people were voting often, marking ballots and stuffing them in boxes. And I went out to a polling place 20-30 miles out of Monrovia where people came in to vote and soldiers were there to intimidate them as they were marking their ballots, and so they would end up voting for Doe.
I solemnly swear, I, Samuel Kenya Doe, solemnly swear that I will support, uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution, and bylaws, of the Republic of Liberia,
He should have lost, but he rigged the election. But at that time, all West African elections were rigged. It was a very normal thing to do for the government to win the election, even though they may have had less than a majority of the votes. So we did not trouble us at all.
Now here comes the head of state, riding a beautiful Mercedes-Benz, a 1000 SEL,
Dough's inauguration was not celebrated in all quarters.
To attend the inaugural church.
I remember describing it in a radio interview at the time as similar, at least from what I could pick up, to the sadness that people felt in the United States when John Kennedy was shot.
We thought that Doe was going to lead us, but Doe betrayed us. He's a criminal. We don't want to kill Doe. We want to bring Doe before justice.
Thomas Quayampa from the Gio tribe of Nimba County in the northeast was one of the 17-man junta that had brought Doe to power. Quayampa fled the country after he and Doe fell out. Now, 1 month after the elections, he entered Monrovia with rebel soldiers to challenge Doe. He declared he had the blessings of both the U.S. and the Liberian people. But in fact, U.S. Embassy officials had tipped Doe off about the possibility of this coup. Quayampa's troops quickly rounded up Doe's officials. They took over the national radio and television station, and for 6 hours Liberians believed that Doe had been overthrown. But then, forces loyal to Doe arrived on the scene to smother the revolt. The victorious Quayampa soon turned victim.
Hey, we are here. So we got here just in time. I mean, it's a prize. We've got it. It's a miracle.
George Boley, Doe's closest advisor, celebrated victory.
And I think it's the best thing that's ever happened.
Quayampa's body was taken to the executive mansion to be viewed by Doe.
Fellow Liberians, I take this opportunity to inform the nation that the coup has failed. I am still the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Liberia and head of state.
It was a victory, but Doe had other troubles. He was losing the support of his main ally, the United States.
We were starting to get quite tough with him. And the fact that the Cold War was ending, I think, was no coincidence. We had less need for his cooperation. I remember I went to see him with Secretary of State Schultz in January of 1987, and he was very upset, Doe saying, I'm your best friend, I kicked out the Libyan embassy that was here, and I support you all over in the UN, even in the non-aligned movement. I'm always one of 3 or 4 African countries that's on your side, and all the rest are against you. And what are you doing? You're cutting off our military assistance, and you're lowering our economic assistance. It's all one-sided now. I'm your friend, but you're not my friend anymore. So he understood that things were changing.
Schultz's warning was more diplomatic.
Fiscal austerity in the short run is essential to long-term prosperity. We're getting a little fiscal austerity at home, and it hurts. The situation calls for statesmanlike decisions. The result is not usually immediate, but there is no more important task.
He actually became hysterical with Secretary Schultz at the time. Even though later everything was friendly, there was a nice dinner.
And Schultz said, well, we'll send you some help. So they sent over 17 bean counters, basically, from the State Department. And they were just despairing. When I saw them, they were basically packing up their stuff and going home and saying this is a hopeless endeavor. And they left.
With or without U.S. support, Doe was bent on staying in power. Since Quayampa's insurrection, Doe had brutally suppressed any dissent in Nimba County. Time and again, he would send soldiers of his tribe, the Kras, on a campaign of terror against Manos and Gios, a tribal war.
And those who is considered to be innocent in Nimba at this particular time, I'm appealing to them to leave Nimba immediately, or else their relative, their children would never be seen again.
When I first came to Liberia in 1986, when I first started this job, one of the things that impressed me was that it was one of the least tribal countries in the region. A lot of intermarriage, and people weren't at all hung up about their tribe. They could be quite proud of it. They could say, this cook shop has real Vi cooking here, whatever. And I saw that gradually evaporate, and I think that was the most damaging, the most corrosive effect of President Doe's government. For people up in Nimba County, nothing has ever been worse than what was happening to them. The army was sent into Nimba, and they would go around all the houses, they would drag out young men, they would beat them, some of them they would kill them. The army created enormous ill feeling, and that drove the boys over the border to become rebels, and they were just there waiting to be organized by Charles Taylor.
Charles Taylor, an old crony of Samuel Doe, crossed the Liberian border on Christmas Eve 1989. A mixed Gola and Americo-Liberian, Taylor graduated from an American college and broke out of a Massachusetts jail, where he had been held after Doe accused him of embezzlement. Now he was back, with Libyan-trained guerrillas, and rumored to have the backing of affluent Liberians who wanted to get rid of Doe.
This war is about justice, it's about equality, and about fair play. This war is about the right to self-determination and the safeguard of the sovereignty of this nation.
Despite his rhetoric, his war turned into a war of retribution. Thousands of Manos and Guios joined Taylor, seeking vengeance against Doe's Kras and their allies, the Mandingos. Atrocities were routine. Entire villages were abandoned by people trying to escape the fighting. Families were burnt alive, children raped and decapitated. It was ethnic cleansing at its most cruel, and much of it was carried out by soldiers who were themselves children.
People has put us together, gave us arm to fight our brothers and sisters to get rich out of us. And those little ones that are holding the guns, they are not intelligent, they cannot think. And a little boy, even if you are in a home, just watch a little boy, how he can behave in the home. And imagine you take gun, you give it to him.
Boys got high on power as well as drugs. I spoke to one in a refugee camp in Ghana.
I'm Marshall G. Colley. I was 15 years old when I joined the MPFL in 1991. There was a certain leaf in the bush, we call it wolf face. You take the leaf, you squeeze it in your hand and put it in your eye, and you'll see that your eyes will be red, like for some 1 week. Yeah, so we used to call it leaf wolf face. You just want to make yourself like a kind of a boo-boo man that people will be afraid of. Like when you take out your eye on somebody, I mean, they will be afraid. You will never be afraid when you're taking the drugs. Actually, you will be over brave, and all the things you will be doing, I mean, you will just be going, you will be doing it unconsciously, but you will be really brave. There's nothing that will move you. You just smile, laugh all day. As soon as they shoot here, you will like to go there.
During these months of terror, Liberians were still so emotionally tied to the U.S. that they believed America would save them from themselves. When U.S. Navy helicopters landed in Monrovia, it was thought that they had come to rescue Liberians. Instead, they were there to evacuate American citizens.
Due to the potential threat to lives, all Americans are strongly advised to depart Liberia immediately. In order to assist Americans, we have arranged special commercial flights to transport American citizens and their immediate families from Liberia to the neighboring country of Cote d'Ivoire.
I'm scared to death, and I'm worried for my country, and I'm scared for everybody.
What do you think the United States should do?
Step in and take over.
That's right.
We were just given a direct order from the White House not to do anything. But I remember meetings where Scowcroft's deputy, Robert Gates, who had come from the CIA, he was denigrating the historical relationship. He says it's meaningless, it doesn't govern us anymore, we treat Liberia just like any other country, and we have no real interest there.
Doe also wanted the U.S. to step in to keep himself in power.
Being a lover of democracy, America would have stepped in to put stop to the bloodshed. But then they, I don't know what they are thinking of. But we are still hoping that America will join us in searching for peace for this country.
By mid-1990, Taylor's troops had captured most of the country and were advancing rapidly on Monrovia. Doe's situation was growing desperate.
We had an aircraft available in Freetown ready to pick him up. We told him that, but actually I was supposed to go there and say, okay, now's the time. Get your family and everyone and get in the plane, let's go. But I never got to that point. It was vetoed.
We are not going to let any criminal be taken out of this country by anyone. No one is taking Doe out. He will be caught by us or killed by us.
I think we could have done some things differently at the end, but the Bush administration pulled us back and told us that they didn't want us to do that because they didn't want to accept any degree of moral responsibility for Charles Taylor becoming the next head of state of Liberia. I think that was a mistake.
I felt that the White House had an error of judgment at that point. Whatever would have happened with Taylor after that, at least the country would have been spared the devastation of its infrastructure and all of its facilities there.
Liberians sought help everywhere. Finally, it was the 16-nation Economic Community of West African States that created ECOMOG, a special military peacekeeping force.
Je me suis impliqué, disons, dans le processus de paix au Libéria en ma qualité de président de la CEDEAO. Mais comme je l'ai dit plus tôt, c'est vrai que aucun Africain, aucun homme, je pense, de cœur, ne peut accepter de voir des souffrances aussi insupportables que celles endurées par le peuple libérien.
The presence of peacekeepers gave Monrovia a fragile sense of security. But Taylor was still threatening to launch a final assault if Doe didn't resign.
I remain here to fight the support of Charles Taylor. I remain here to say no to America. America is fighting Doe because Doe 1 is going to be developed, period.
The African peacekeepers set up headquarters in this building at Monrovia's port. Here, on September 9th, 1990, Doe arrived to meet the force commander. He had no idea that Prince Johnson, the leader of yet another faction, was gunning for him.
No, don't do this to me. Look, I went to the American ambassador. I'm here to make a decision now.
We could hear voices outside. There was an argument starting between those people who were outside and Prince Johnson's people, and the voices got more and more angry.
Now from that point, the shooting started. And Elizabeth Blunt and Mr. Ivan Face were under a table, and unfortunately for me, I was in that particular room they were in.
I lay on the floor along the wall, window wall. And then I could just hear the sounds of this tremendous gun battle, and it went on and on and on. Every time you thought the shooting had stopped, it started again.
When they started shooting from downstairs, Doe came in here and was surrounded by his bodyguards. And they refused, even during the shooting, all the bodyguards fell right in the middle of this room. All of them fell on top of Doe.
I had no idea what was going on, and this went on for about an hour and a half. It was the early afternoon. And then eventually it died away, and we waited, and then it seemed to be safe to come out. And I came out into the corridor, and there was a sort of washroom opposite. There were bodies in the corridor and sort of piled into the washroom. And there were bodies in the front hall of the building at the foot of the stairs where we'd been standing to watch the president go up. And then I was being really stupid at this point. It took me a few minutes to say, but what's happened to the president? And they said they carried him.
Samuel Doe! Samuel Doe! You see crowds and crowds, thousands! I turn up to see Doe.
Doe was driven through the streets of Monrovia. The next day, he was pleading for his life.
So please losing me, so I'll tell you.
While Prince Johnson was seeking the backing of the U.S.
Tango, sunshine calling, emergency over. Tango, that's the sunshine. If you are listening to me, there's emergency over. Tango, come in. I want to see Mr. Porter or the U.S. ambassador over.
It's certainly true the Americans were in touch, not just with Prince Johnson, but with all the parties. And what was said and what was encouraged, I don't know.
Where we remember Zion.
Doe was castrated and his ears cut off by Johnson's men. He would die a day later, but even after his death, he had his supporters who tore through the streets shouting, "No Doe, no Liberia."
Mama Africa, take a look around you. We are your children.
The war didn't end with Doe's death. For the next 7 years, it touched all of our lives. I look at these graves and I think, what happened to this place? Someone's father, someone's daughter, someone's brother. Over 150,000 Liberians died, 4 of my family among them. 2/3 of the country fled their homes. 6,000 children were made to kill.
Mothers are crying over
the towns and villages I knew as a child had all become killing fields. More and more factions cropped up, and some Ecomog soldiers joined in the plunder. There was no respite.
We need your peace, we need your love. Stop the fighting, stop the war.
Liberians were exhausted and desperate for peace. Numerous peace agreements were brokered and violated, but peace only came when there was nothing left to destroy.
We need your love, we need your peace.
Finally, after 7 years of mayhem, elections were called for July 19th, 1997. There were 13 candidates. The campaign trail for Charles Taylor, who already controlled much of the country, led ironically to the Samuel Doe Soccer Stadium. people sang, "He killed my ma, I will vote for him. He killed my pa, I will vote for him," hoping that a vote for Taylor would mean an end to the bloodshed. Liberians lined up to vote in overwhelming numbers. It was their first presidential election in a decade.
Leave your street. Don't talk to anybody. Go to your house.
When the ballots were counted and certified as fair by international observers, including Jimmy Carter, Taylor had won with 75% of the vote.
And I promise you today that I will not be a wicked president. But I say to you also that I have no intentions of being a weak president during this particular period.
When Taylor assumed the presidency, people hoped that he would turn the country around. So far, not much has happened. Instead, in no time, Taylor has become an international pariah, implicated in the destabilization of his neighbors, and accused of fueling diamond wars and growing rich. Just another strongman.
Oh, Melling, Melling, oh, Melling, Melling.
When Monrovia spruced itself up to commemorate 150 years of Liberian independence, it was the monument dedicated to unity between the natives and the settlers that got special attention. And it was here that a wedding party stopped to take a photograph, much as they did in the old days. In a way, this is a statement of faith, an implied trust that Liberia will one day be a place where peace prevails and people flourish. The independence was celebrated with pomp and well-pressed uniforms. It was an African occasion, but the trappings were still American, a relic of the shared, distant past. Liberia may indeed be a stepchild of America, but it is also a rightful daughter of Africa, with a rich history. A history of triumph, of sadness, of disappointment, and of hope.
Peace, love, and coconut oil.
Hey man, that's racist! Please remember that from now on, brand new never-before-seen videos, as well as live streams, will only be available on my website, ikyg.com, via a Patreon subscription. ikyg.com is a Black-owned, Black-ran platform, 100% free from censorship. It's the only place where we don't have to worry about what we say and expressing ourselves. Make sure you check out the description and the comment section for important links, as well as information in video form that shows you what benefits you get when you support the site and join my Patreon. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, then don't forget to subscribe and be notified every time I upload a video. For exclusive content and perks, check out my Patreon. This is where we have private live streams, group chats, live Q&As, live phone calls, and open topics. This is a safe space where you can interact with other like-minded people, make friends, send each other direct private messages, and so much more without any trolls. And yes, you get to use GIFs and images in the live chats. So what are you waiting for? This is a completely independent website, free from censorship. If you'd like to make a donation towards the site so we can continue to put out the truth without fear of being silenced, then please hit that donation button. It's greatly appreciated. Check out the rest of the site for videos, private and public live streams, find out all the tea, and make sure to utilize the Black Money section of the website. Advertise your business absolutely free to people that look like you, free forever. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Angel_IKYG.